Is that okay, Tom?
Yes, thanks very much, Adam. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
Good. Thanks for that introduction. Nice to be here with you all. So I'm Thomas Muinzer. I'm the co-director of the Aberdeen University Centre for Energy Law, which is attached to the University of Aberdeen. It works on climate and energy related issues in the research space. It's also involved in educational activity. And I'm just going to speak to you direct today, so no PowerPoint or things like that. And look forward to potentially getting our discussion going afterwards in the Q&A as well. So as Adam said, the overall theme is using the law to defend the climate this evening. My particular focus is on law and the climate emergency, international and national frameworks. And I'm going to focus primarily on the international legal framework, just in terms of time and things like that. And I think first off, it's probably worth beginning by asking, why should we even care about international climate law? And by we, I mean you and me. None of us are working at the UN, I assume, which established the UNFCCC agreement that we'll come to shortly. The vast majority of us, I assume, aren't working in law firms on climate law directly. So it's worth considering why you and why we should actually care about what goes on up there in relation to international legal frameworks. The answer to that isn't so difficult. International climate law frameworks are playing a big part in shaping states' political and legal responses to climate change, including the UK. And so if we want to understand what's going on around us, we want to have a decent understanding of what's happening up there with regard to these international frameworks. And we also want to have awareness, I'd suggest, because we want to participate in the discussion and we want to shape it directly. So to improve the climate, and indeed our world in general, people like you and me, us, we've got to stand up and participate in the debate and to help drive the momentum for change. And if you really want to participate meaningfully in that debate as to the direction we're headed in relation to tackling climate change, and we need to stand up and hold governments, parliaments, fossil fuel industry, others, to high progressive standards of accountability. If we really want to participate meaningfully in that process, it's hard to do that in a meaningful way if we really don't fully appreciate what's going on, in particular in the context of international climate frameworks. So with that, let's take a look at the international climate law framework. Let's try and get to the heart of what's really been going on there, so we're well informed about it and we can bring our knowledge and our views to bear as participants in that political process. So a good starting point, I think, to get a clear picture of the international vista and how it's developed can be to fix certain key milestones in our mind. And I'd encourage you to do that. So milestones, so a key major reference point that help us chart how things unfold. And the first milestone I encourage us to fix in our minds is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Came in 1992, often abbreviated to the UNFCCC. But in fact, we actually need to go back, I think, a little before that, to when the orchestra was tuning up, as it were. If you go to hear an orchestra and they start playing a symphony, what happens before that is they're tuning up the instruments and so on. It can be a bit of a cacophony, but there's an important preface to the main event, if you like. And when we think in those terms, it's actually useful to recognize the first World Climate Conference was not in 92, it was back in 1979. So that's not that close to 92. So back in the late 70s, the first World Climate Conference occurs. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we'll be used to hearing about, the important scientific body, the IPCC, that was set up in the late 80s, 1988. So again, quite some time ago, if we think about it. And its first report, its first major assessment report of the climate problem on scientific grounds, that came out in 1990. So all of this is going on prior to the first major international framework being constructed and put in place, the UNFCCC, in 1992. And there was a second World Climate Conference in 1990. And that intersected with these sort of drivers coming from the IPCC, underlining the scientific severity of the problem. So when we get to 91, their international committees are meeting and trying to construct some kind of meaningful international framework. So you have that background. And then in 92, the UNFCCC text is opened at the Earth Summit in Rio for signature, and it goes into actual force in 94. So there's an initial milestone. And so that's all well and good. But what does that actually mean for us? I think to know that, its significance, what it really means, one needs to take a look at the UNFCCC itself to try and interpret what it's saying and doing. It is an international treaty, which is a not insignificant item of law, and it tries to provide a framework for addressing climate change internationally. Its sort of primary intention is really to limit average global temperature increases that were arising as a consequence of climate change. So it takes on so-called mitigation. And another that was recognized carefully in the document is to deal with the impacts, current and projected, arising from climate change adaptation. So we start to see this binary mitigation adaptation sphere emerging in international law. And there's a further emphasis on trying to begin to set up the rudiments of an international structure that could enable green finance flows to help support decarbonization and stimulate renewables deployment around the world and all of that. So it tries to achieve international cooperation on the climate issue, and it goes some way towards that, but it's best seen, I strongly suggest, as a starting point. It's certainly not a conclusion. It's certainly not an end in its own right. There are nothing like legally binding greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets coming down from that framework regime to countries like the UK and so on. It doesn't have teeth. It's not enforceable. So what does that mean? In a sense, it's really a diplomatic achievement, but legally it's very weak. So milestone 1, UNFCCC 92, we've got a starting point here. That's a diplomatic achievement, yes, but legally very weak and more work to be done. So as we proceed as in the development of these regimes, the first COP meeting was back in '95, these Conference of the Parties meetings that we're probably all familiar with. That happens in Berlin. They get up and running. UNFCCC Secretariat is set in place in '96 to support action under the convention. And then we get to what I would construe as the next milestone that we might fix in our mind usefully. That's the Kyoto Protocol. That's adopted at COP3. So milestone number 2, if you like. Negotiations around that commenced in '95. And the purpose really was to try and build on the UNFCCC and toughen that regime up, really. And in 1997, it's adopted in Kyoto in Japan. And crucially, Kyoto implements legally binding embedded reduction targets at the international level, and they are applied downward, if you will, to developed countries. And it goes into force a bunch of years later in February 2005, but you get it set in place 97, goes live 2005. And during that time, interesting things are happening. 2001, you get the release of the IPCC's third assessment report, again underscoring and refining knowledge scientifically as regards the climate problem. The fourth report comes out in 2007. So with the Kyoto Protocol going into force in 2005, these scientific reports are beginning kind of more and more, in a sense, to, you could say, enter into popular consciousness and become a key driver of the legal regime, what it should do, what it's thought it'd be useful to do, and to provide a sense of the scale of the problem against the backdrop of these frameworks. Kyoto has a particular implementation period, and that's 2008 to 2012, and that's where the reduction targets go live. So milestone 1, we've got UNFCCC 1992. Milestone 2, we've got Kyoto Protocol that was agreed in 97, and we've got this phase where the targets, if you will, go live 2008 to 2012, the so-called commitment period. Now, America sat that out, China sat that out, India sat that out. So major emitting nations were not participant, some were, and it placed a 5% greenhouse gas emissions reduction burden on developed nations who were participating in the process. The EU was participating. It got an 8% reduction target. So 8% GHG reduction required over that period of 2008 to 2012 based on 1990 levels. And that sits within the overall 5% target aggregated under Kyoto. UK got 12.5% at that time. So you have a 5% figure, 37 industrialized countries participate, and the European Union, it's called the European Community back then, but the EU. So some good news, I'd suggest, if we're taking stock where milestones, things are getting a bit tougher. We got some top-down legally binding reduction targets. Do they go nearly far enough? Absolutely not. Do they cover all nations? Absolutely not. But there's some progress in a positive direction when we get the milestone 2. The rudiments of a more sophisticated international architecture, a sense of direction, something to build on. Then we come to what I would suggest we think of as milestone 3, UNFCCC, Kyoto 1, and then milestone 3, which we could call Kyoto Protocol Phase 2, or we might call it, trying to pare out legal jargon and mush, but we might call it the Doha Amendment period, because the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol created the extension of Phase 1, compliance Phase 1, 2008 to 2012. It extended that to a new phase, 2013 to 2020. But at any rate, we've got milestone 3, the second Kyoto period fixed in our minds, hopefully, running from 1st of January 2013 to 2020. And in this second commitment period, that 5% target is ramped up to 18%. So an 18% overall commitment to reduce GHGs. However, China hadn't ratified the agreement, India, the US, and in fact, if you look back to Phase 1, Canada in particular had been totally delinquent in Phase 1. It subscribed to the agreement, continued to increase its emissions, and actually just exited the agreement in 2011 prior to the closure of the compliance period in 2012. It's interesting to look at what the consequences of that decision were. Basically, there were none. So I would suggest that highlights the weakness, the lack of teeth in the international regime. Still, is it pointless? Is it useless? No, it's going in the direction, but we have a realistic view as to enforceability, as to stringency, as perhaps to how seriously it's been taken by many countries, perhaps. Also at Kyoto 2, our milestone, third milestone, Japan pulls out. It will not ratify Kyoto 2. I think that was a heavy symbolic blow to international climate law. I say symbolic because it's called the Kyoto Protocol for a reason. It was agreed in Kyoto initially, which is in Japan. Japan facilitated in large part the agreement and was a big part of its success initially. So when it pulled out, I mean, it's not unlike if France pulled out of the Paris Agreement, let's say, which was agreed in Paris. So there's a symbolic blow as well as a literal blow in terms of the lack of participation from Japan, literal in terms of fighting emissions and so forth. New Zealand had participated in Kyoto 1, it withdrew, Russian Federation, so more blows. But worst of all, I think Kyoto 2 was not brought into legal force. I think came in sort of right at the end of the period in 2020 or so, kind of nominally. But this 2013 to 2020 period, it was not brought in to legal force by the international community. Now, not bringing a legal regime into law is about as serious a problem as one can encounter as a lawyer, I think. And note that the media doesn't spend time highlighting that issue, hear very little about it. I work in the academic sector. There's also very, very little deep critical consideration of the implications of all that in expert commentary. And just without going into detail, the reason it wasn't brought into law in part was basically 3/4 of the international signatories needed to ratify that agreement for it to be triggered live in law, and the numbers didn't get up. So that should, I think, concern us all very much indeed. So milestone summary, we've got milestone 1, bit weak, but perhaps a good start, UNFCCC. Milestone 2, we've got improvements, we've got strengthening under Kyoto 1, and we've got milestone 3, perhaps a great opportunity for strengthening and building and developing, but in fact, things are weakened through a lack of uptake of that agreement. And it wasn't perfect in its own right, but surely weakened there. And then we get a sort of curveball thrown. Milestone 4, as I would see it, would be the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is brought in alongside Kyoto 2, which we recall is spanning 2013 to 2020, not brought into force, but it's still running to some extent. For example, the EU participated regardless of its lack of legal force at the international level. So Paris comes in, we need to look at that then if we're seriously thinking about our milestones and interpreting them. 2015, we reached the Paris Agreement. It brings the global community together. It's hailed as a major achievement. While media is ignoring largely Kyoto 2, it does not ignore this. It's trumpeted over the media, a lot of attention on it. It's considered a great breakthrough in international diplomacy. I think in a sense it probably really was. But we need to qualify that with our understanding now of the Kyoto 2 phase. So it's against that backdrop, but in a sense it was to some extent a great breakthrough in diplomacy. It enhanced financial and diplomatic support to assist developing countries with decarbonization, renewables deployment, and so on. And also prior to Paris, a broad intention had been to strive to hold the rise in global temperature this century below 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. Paris cements that, but also says we should pursue efforts to go further and try and keep that to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it also establishes a national reporting process that must feed into the global monitoring system in really a more sophisticated way. There's a global stock take of emissions and so on that occurs every 5 years under this framework. And within that, countries, UK, others, are required to sketch out and deposit a statement of their best reduction efforts and their plans to meet those emissions reductions. And that statement occurs on a rolling basis, and it's lodged with the UNFCCC Secretariat. And I'm trying to sort of avoid jargon, but those are the so-called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. So UK will sketch out a kind of emissions reduction level over time and provide a sense of the policy plans that are intended to secure that. And the law in this case, it's interesting to note, stated that it would go live about a month, 30 days, after the date in which at least 55 parties to the convention, accounting for at least an estimated 50% of emissions, basically ratified or accepted it or approved it. And so the Paris Agreement was ratified quite easily and went into force. But note what a lower bar you have there, where you're talking about 55 parties. With the Kyoto Protocol, you were, needing 150 or so, you're 3/4. So much lower bar, goes into force relatively easily. So all well and good to some extent, but again, we have to take a careful look at this, and we have to ask what it actually means for us. What's its effect? What's it doing? Well, it paralyzes the slightly more robust Kyoto track, and then it crushes it. You're not going to hear talk now about Kyoto 3, about Kyoto 1, Kyoto period 2. Kyoto is basically done. Paris has taken over now. So it's reconfigured this emerging top-down style regime, these targets coming down, toughening up a bit, and set in place a bottom-up style regime where states can set their own nationally determined contributions. States set them, and there's no meaningful enforcement mechanism to secure compliance. So it depends on what commentators and others call so-called voluntary mitigation contributions from states. Countries are meant to increase their NDC contributions over time, but you've got to put faith in that, this ratcheting process. So there's a particular picture of the Paris Agreement. I'd just like to quote Climate Focus, which has a very good assessment of the Paris Agreement. In the Paris Agreement, which is the name of its assessment, Climate Focus summarizes, quote, "The Paris Agreement puts emphasis on process rather than on defined mitigation goals. Unlike the Kyoto Protocol," so the other track we've been talking about, "the Paris Agreement does not formulate country-specific emissions targets. Instead, the Paris Agreement depends on voluntary mitigation contributions." So we've a sense of a shift and a change here, and we have to think through, you, me, in our own terms, what we make of that process. But we can see clearly, hopefully, a Kyoto track that was doing certain things. Media doesn't particularly dwell on it. That is basically defunct now. We've the Paris Agreement, diplomatic achievement certainly, but we can see clearly, hopefully, that it relies in no small part on states to step up and put forth robust mitigation levels, and indeed to put forward robust adaptation plans and to secure those over time. One might be skeptical as to how fulsomely that can just be left in states' hands in a bottom-up way at the moment, in some kind of unconstrained, unchecked way, given that we are not doing what we need to do at the moment around the world, here and elsewhere, to tackle the climate emergency in a sufficient way. So the conclusions we draw, start to sum up, are important on all this. As we said at the outset, these international climate law frameworks are playing a big part in shaping states' political and legal responses to climate change right now. So we want to have an awareness of these factors. We want to have a good sense of what's going on. We want to have that good understanding of what happened with Kyoto, because if things are going to be kept on track, it seems to me people like us need to participate in the discussion and help shape it and drive it, especially with this bottom-up statist approach now in the international sphere. So again, let's recall states historically have not been taking the robust action that's needed in this area to deal with the problems we see around us, and the scientists are telling us are going to get worse and worse. And given the weakening of that international climate regime and the massive level of extra voluntary wriggle room that's now given to state governments and state institutions under the Paris regime. To improve things, I think we're going to have to come together in an informed way, participate in the needed momentum for change, and in a way that keeps pressure on states to raise their standards and responses in the context of that international framework. And we'll need to do this, I think, on a broad front. So we're holding governments to account and so on, but also the fossil fuel industry and other powerful and substantial actors who all need to be held, I think, to reasonable account in this process. So that, so far as I can see, at least in a sort of potted summary, is a core takeaway message when we look at those general international climate law milestones. So a takeaway message for all of us at the present time. So I'll stop there. Thank you.